Hello and what is up, YouTube? My name is G3Iron, and in today's 13th episode of our featured build discussion, we are featuring Tomahawk U's Queenliness Wander. You can see he's got videos walking through the build in multiple different leagues, and with this most updated 3.9 edition, yes, this is a Wander build that can take down all of the Conquerors, including Cirrus, and he's got a featured video showing off that particular fight, so I would highly recommend that you go and give him a like, subscribe, and ding the bell. For those of you who are new to the channel, you can of course like, subscribe, and ding the bell to be notified about new discussions just like this one. And at this point in time, there should be above my slightly balding forehead appearing a couple of different timestamps if you ever want to jump ahead or revisit any of our discussion points that we talk about today as we review Tomahawk's Queenliness Wander. So Tomahawk has done a great job of laying out some pros and cons, so without further ado, let's jump right in. First off, it is a Pathfinder Wander build, which means it is fast. If you are looking to put together a build that quickly consumes all content available in 3.9 and presumably moving forward into 3.10, then this is going to be a build for you. Wanders are super duper secret OP at the moment. They haven't received a buff in a long time, which means a whole lot of players have no idea what exactly a Wander build is. They are incredibly fast and their DPS is incredibly reliable, as well as you're willing to play a little bit of the piano with your Flasks. At that point, your damage becomes very reliable, and you will see that your defenses also become very reliable with the flask setup that Tomahawk recommends. This build also offers itself as a fairly consistent and strong league starter. You do have to have a little bit of knowledge about how to generate currency, but no worries. That's what our playlist Bank of Exile is there for, to help you actually generate currency whenever you start a new league. So as long as you've got some idea about how you're going to strategically garner currency in a new league, then this particular build will scale up with the amount of currency that you accrue and dump into this particular build. This build has got a high ceiling for the top amounts of DPS and survivability that can hit. So the more currency you generate, if it's at the beginning of a league, that's fine. If it's also at the end of a league and you just got a ton of currency that you want to throw at something, this is another build that you will see yourself be able to get incremental and serious sustainable levels of growth with every single new item upgrade that you're able to afford. This is indeed a level 100 viable build, so those of you who want to push for level 100, it's fast and it's safe. That's basically the two combining factors that you're looking for whenever you're putting together a build that you want to push to level 100. You never want to die, because dying means that you lose a whole bunch of experience, and of course if you're playing hardcore you lose your character, but you lose a whole bunch of experience if you're pushing for level 100. And of course you want it to be fast, right? Speed is of the essence when you are pushing for level 100 to actually not go insane as you're pushing for level 100. So a build that can push quickly and safely is a wonderful template for you to be able to push to level 100. Alright, so enough of the pros. Let's get into the cons. This build is not cheap. You've heard me say it's a good league starter if you've got a strategic plan for accruing currency. That translates to saying, look, you better have some currency if you want to scale this build up. Don't go in with league starter gear and assume that you're going to be able to take down tier 16 maps, right? That's not the way how this works. You're going to have to scale up your currency into the build if you want this particular build to perform at its peak. It's also weak to single target damage until you get a couple of key items, and so you'll have to be aware of different sources of single target damage, whether that's bosses, whether that's metamorphs, whether that's another league mechanic that you are worried about. If there is a single shot mechanic that is in the zone that you are in, you need to be aware of it, because this particular build doesn't have a massive health pool. It tops out at around 5 to 6.5k in terms of its HP pool. So if you're looking for something that's got 10k HP or 10k energy shield, that is not this build. Getting the right colors for this particular build for gems can also be a bit of a pain. So Tomahawk gives us a preview that you're actually going to want to make sure that you've got plenty of chromatics, so that way you can actually roll the colors that you need on the gear that you need for this particular build to work. You could also use Varici in your safe house if you are loading up and pursuing the betrayal mechanic in order to get the particular colors or white sockets that are ideal for your 6th link that you will be using. Lastly, this does get very expensive towards the end game, since of course you want tier 1 life rolls on basically every item, and of course you want as much evasion as possible, because this is a Queen of the Forest based build, which means we're going to go incredibly fast. If you have not played a build that goes fast, try this build. You will go fast. So enough of the pros and cons, let's dive into the passive tree. There's a couple of key things to note here. First off, our primary layer of defense on this particular Queenliness Wander character is going to be acrobatics and phase acrobatics. You're going to want to go out of your way to grab these as soon as possible as a defensive layer. For me personally, whenever I'm playing a build, if it uses acro and phase acro, I make a beeline towards it. That's the first thing that I get on a character. If I'm using it whatsoever, it's my primary defensive boost, and as soon as you get it, you will notice it, whether you're leveling through the campaign or whether you are going into maps. If you're not using acro and phase acro, but your build suggests that you use it, go out of your way to get it, and you will notice that your survivability goes through the roof on a more consistent basis. After grabbing acro and phase acro, one thing that you'll notice about this build is it spends a lot of time coming all the way up here to the top of the tree to come and grab the Elder Power, the Disintegration, and the Fusillade. The Fusillade, try saying that 10 times fast. The Fusillade wheel. Anyway, you want to get this entire wheel, because this entire wheel gives you a whole bunch of damage and a whole bunch of crit on this entire wheel. So you're going to want to make a beeline for this as soon as you can for damage. So make priorities out of grabbing acro and phase acro first for defensive purposes, then come up and grab the Elder Power wheel for offensive purposes, and then fill in life and jewel sockets wherever you can. A lot of the time, players wonder which side of the tree they ought to go on first. I am going to make a beeline as I build my character all the way up to the top here. Just go out of your starting area, come over and grab phase acro and acro, and then make a beeline up towards the Elder Power node, and then fill everything else in. You can fill in things like Cracking Speed, or fill in things like Arcing Blow. Me personally, if I'm not pushing to level 100 and I'm looking to cut points off of this tree, I'm not grabbing the entire Written in Blood node circle. That's 4 passive points that you can avoid right there. I will actually come over and grab coordination and all of the various buffs that you get along here, because it's a little bit of life, but it's also some crit strike multi and some crit strike chance, so definitely going to grab that. But coming down into the duelist node, the other spots that you're going to want to grab is definitely Golem's Blood, because that's a lot of life for you. And then very, very importantly, you're going to want to get Profane Chemistry, because once you ascend as a Pathfinder, we're always going to be smashing our flasks and having our flasks up as much as possible. If you are not prepared to play a build where you are keeping your flasks up, then don't play this build. If you are ready to see the power of flasks in Path of Exile, then play this build and make your way as maybe the 3rd or 4th thing that you go to on your passive tree towards Profane Chemistry, and you will see that there is a whole bunch of flask effectiveness that is applied to you, and you'll see your flasks like you've never seen them before. You'll start looking at flasks and being like, oh man, what kind of build can I build around this? Simply because Pathfinders are exceptional. They are the flask ascendancy, the flask character in Path of Exile, and they feel great when you play them well and when you keep your flasks up for the majority of the time. Moving on to the Ascendancy, we are, of course, a Pathfinder, and Tomahawk recommends that you go grab Nature's Boon and then Master Alchemist first, which gives you immune to elemental ailments during any flask effect. This is really, really nice as you are leveling throughout the 10x story campaign of Path of Exile, because you won't ever have to worry about rolling your flasks for, let's say, Freeze effect, or let's say Ignite effect, Burning effect. You don't have to worry about that. And then, of course, you just gain 20% chance to freeze, shock, and ignite during any flask effect, meaning that as you are dealing elemental damage, you've got this whole boost to your character as you are actually dealing elemental status effects and ailments to the characters, to the monsters that you are hitting. It's quite a nice boost of damage, but it's also quite a nice quality of life boost as you are leveling through the campaign, especially if you're starting off in a new league. Again, so many players are going to look at a Pathfinder build and say, oh, it's just too expensive for me to league start with. But there's actually a lot of quality of life that's built into a Pathfinder to get started. And it's so incredibly fast that you are going to be able to generate a whole ton of currency, because you're going to be running maps like crazy. You're going to fly through maps and generate more XP per hour and more currency per hour than you would on any other average starter build. After you grab Nature's Boon and after you grab Master Alchemist, you're going to come over and grab Veteran Bowyer, which gives you 10% of physical damage as extra damage of a random element. We are, of course, doing elemental damage in this particular build, which means we can stack lots of different ways of gaining elemental damage that is going to be either additive or multiplicative to our damage. Damage is also going to penetrate 10% of elemental resistances. which is fantastic. Since the 3.9 update, monsters and bosses have got a bit more elemental resistances, so ascendancies that have built-in elemental pen in them are even more valuable now than they were prior to 3.9. So while some players might have looked at Pathfinder during the 3.9 nerf cycle and say, oh, well, Pathfinder's not going to have enough damage in order to deal with the various buffs to life and to HP, well, I'm here to tell you, and so is Tomahawk Q, to say that you can do enough damage on a Pathfinder. Trust me, you will be just fine. You're going to pen all of the elemental resistances that you need to, and you're going to explode anything that's in your path. Lastly, you've got a line of stats that gives you enemies you kill that are affected by elemental ailments grant 100% increased flask charges. So you've heard me say it a couple of times. You're going to need to be managing your flasks and essentially playing the piano while you play a Pathfinder build. But no worries, because the vast majority of the time you're still going to have a ton of flask charges on your build because you are a Pathfinder. So you're not only getting the flask effectiveness, but you're also getting flask recharges at a much, much faster rate than anyone else in the game. Lastly, you're going to grab Nature's Adrenaline, which gives you 15% increased movement speed during any flask effect. Mind you, this isn't on top of like your movement speed adrenaline flask, so you just go incredibly fast. And then you also get 20% increased attack speed during any flask effect as you are using any sort of attack-based skill, like, I don't know, Barrage, for instance. Speaking of Barrage, you can of course set up your build with a Barrage setup, or you can do Power Siphon with Barrage support setup. So there are a couple of different ways that you can play this particular build, and at one point Tomahawk Q actually says in the build guide, you can even set this build up with a 4-link Kinetic Blast, which by the way is an attack skill, which means you're getting the attack bonus from your final ascendancy. Anyway, you can set this build up essentially any way you want, and it is going to deal damage. If you want to only go with a 4-link Kinetic Blast, let's say, for instance, you could do that. If you want to set it up with Barrage, let's say you get lucky and you get a Barrage Helm enchant, you can do that. Or, of course, you can go with the most recent iteration of the build, which is what Tomahawk U is using at the moment, which is using a Power Siphon 6-link. So the links that he's got set up here are Power Siphon, and then Elemental Damage with Attacks, or Awakened Elemental Damage with Attacks, Awakened Elemental Focus, or regular Elemental Focus, Energy Leech, Barrage Support, and then Awakened added lightning damage, because we are doing a whole boatload of lightning damage. If you're looking at the path of building right now, you can see the total life on the build is about 6.6k life, but then the damage on this thing from Power Siphon is over 4 million damage. It's nearly pushing 5 million damage. Now granted, this is with all of our flasks up, this is with all of our modifiers on the average damage. The total DPS for this sucker is just out of this world. Again, this is with a whole bunch of different boxes check marked. So don't think as though you're going to just walk into Cyrus and one-shot him. It's still going to be a bit of a fight. Nonetheless, this should prove to you, this should show you, those of you who are Path of Building warriors, that you can take this build, scale it up, and use this build throughout the life cycle of a league to take down any boss that you want, whether it's Shaper, whether it's Elder, whether it's Uber Elder, whether it's Cyrus level 1, whether it's Cyrus level 8. You will be able to take on that content as you learn those fights. You've got to watch out for the one-shot mechanics, but as long as you're speedy enough to get out of the way of those one-shot mechanics, then this build will not only be able to cruise through maps at an incredible speed, but it will also be able to take down bosses at a rate that is also pleasing. Generally in Path of Exile, you've got to choose between fast or bossing, and this particular build takes both of those things and pushes them to the extreme, where you can kill bosses at a fast rate and you can map at an incredibly fast rate. For gear on this particular build, the star of the show is going to be the Queen of the Forest Destiny leather. If you don't have your hands on one of these, then consider getting it as soon as you can. Basically, this whole build revolves around the increased movement speed that you are getting per 600 evasion rating, up to 75% increased move speed. So if you want to go fast, if you want to run through maps and clear them fast, if you want to tell other buddies in your guild that you are clearing maps at 2 to 3 times the speed they are, then this is the build for you, and this is the item that makes the whole build tick. Because of this particular stat line, we want as much evasion rating on our build as we can get. This is going to inform the decisions that we make about every other single piece of gear that we are going to get on this build. We're going to get an evasion helmet, we're going to get an evasion shield, we're going to get evasion boots, we're going to try to get evasion on our rings, we're going to try to get evasion onto our amulet. Everywhere that we can get evasion, we are going to try to get evasion. Of course, that's great because as a defensive layer, we just don't get hit, right? Simple. Point to forehead, don't get hit, solve the game, never die, right? But on top of that, you're getting movement speed from all of this evasion that you are stacking. So if you are looking for a build that can go super duper fast, you're looking at Queen of the Forest, Destiny Leather, and then scaling up as much evasion as you can possibly get on all of your gear. For the shield slot, you are going to want to use an Elder Buckler because it gives you an implicit of 9% increased move speed. And then, of course, you're going to want to get as much evasion rating on the shield as possible. If you can roll dodge chance on your particular Elder Shield, that's also great. And then, of course, you're looking for other top-tier rolls like life, like percentage increased life, and like elemental resistances. But the key here is that rather than looking for, let's say, additional damage out of your shield, you don't need that damage. So instead, go for speed and go for resistances and life. In the helmet slot, you are again looking for an evasion-based helmet. And of course, if you can get a helmet that gives you a lab enchant for Power Siphon, this is one of the things that I really loved that Tomahawk Yush points out in the build. Usually, wand builds are incredibly expensive because they are competing with bow users for Barrage lab enchant helms. Because we're using Power Siphon or Kinetic Blast, we don't have to compete with bow users who are going for that Barrage lab enchant. We can simply go out and get a Power Siphon enchant, and that will give us a massive boost because our Power Siphon will actually fire 2 additional projectiles that essentially acts as a more multiplier and will do a whole bunch of damage. Of course, if you can craft this particular style of helmet, the big stat line that you are looking for here is nearby enemies have -X to lightning resistance because, of course, the vast majority of the damage that we are doing is indeed lightning damage. And so our Power Siphon is simply going to shred whatever is in our way. It's going to disappear, essentially. But if anything is near to you, it's going to have even less lightning resistance that you're going to have to worry about. Lastly, we'll really quickly touch on the Flasks. Of course, for a Pathfinder build, how could we talk about a Pathfinder build and not talk about the Flasks? You're going to want to go for a Wise Oak because, of course, you're getting reduced elemental damage taken, but then you're also dealing additional damage for that particular damage element that you have got the highest uncapped elemental resistance. So, of course, we are aiming for lightning resistance here in this particular slot, unless we can just line up all of our resistances perfectly, where all 3 resistances will come into play for both effects. If you're new to Path of Exile and you didn't know this, Wise Oak allows you to essentially play around with your numbers. If all of your resistance numbers are the exact same, then both effects take place for all elemental resistances, both offensively and defensively. So consider that. It can be a bit of a pain to balance around Wise Oak. If you're just dealing lightning damage and you really just want to focus on the lightning resistance, on breaking through lightning resistance, and on dealing that lightning damage, then you can do that as well. Just worry about your lightning resistance at that point in order to get Wise Oak to apply for that particular style, for that particular type of elemental damage that you're dealing. You're also going to want to get a Vessel of Vinctar. This particular type of Vessel of Vinctar gives you 10% more damage, so just straight up more multiplier while it's there. And then, of course, you know, you've got other things that are also boosting your flask effectiveness because you are a Pathfinder. And then it also reads shocks nearby enemies during the flask effect, causing 10% increased damage taken, which, by the way, is another more multiplier. You are shocked during the flask effect, causing 50% increased damage taken. It adds 35 to 128 lightning damage to attacks during flask effect. By the way, remember, Kinetic Blast, Barrage, and Power Siphon are all attacks. You then gain 30% of lightning damage leached as life during the flask effect, 30% of lightning damage leached as mana during the flask effect, and then you gain life and mana from leech instantly during the flask effect. So, for those of you who are old-time Path of Exile veterans, you can remember the days where Life Leech was instant with Volpact, and we've got a mini Volpact right here with the Vessel of Vinctar Topaz Flask. Next up, we're going to use a Bottled Faith Sulfur Flask. This, of course, grants us a whole bunch of critical strike chance against enemies that are on consecrated ground during this particular flask effect. And, of course, we've got a whole bunch of duration on this particular Bottled Faith. You can see when it's rolled up to perfect quality, it's 6.24 seconds. That is a bunch of uptime for this particular flask effect and for this particular amount of increased damage that enemies are going to be taken because of your increased critical strike chance. Then, of course, on top of this, your consecrated consecrated ground that's created by this flask has tripled radius, so you don't have to stand next to something, right? Usually consecrated ground is a really little tiny, it's like the genie. He's like this massive guy, and he's stuck in a little teeny tiny bottle. Well, the reality is for bottled faith, you can stand about half a screen away from something. Not quite half a screen away, maybe it's somewhere between a half and a third, but you can stand a decent distance away from whatever it is that you are actually attacking, and as long as they're not flying around, moving around, or flicker striking around, or something like that, you will always be getting that bonus from the 2% to critical strike chance, because enemies are on that consecrated ground that was created by your bottled faith. Next up, you're going to want a Chemist Stibnite Flask of Adrenaline. This is going to give you a smoke cloud, which is very, very beneficial. We'll come back to that in just a moment, but also it's going to give you 30% increased movement speed during the flask effect. So again, we are stacking movement speed with the Queen of the Forest. We are stacking movement speed with our passive tree. We are stacking movement speed with our itemization on our shield, and we are stacking movement speed on our ascendancy through the Pathfinder. And now we are also stacking movement speed on top of movement speed on top of movement speed with our flasks. For those of you who are new and don't know what a smoke cloud is, this is what a smoke cloud does. As soon as you pop off your Stibnite Flask, it creates a ground effect that inflicts blind. Blind simply is a debuff that lessens the chance to hit of the affected target by 50%. Okay, by 50%. So as soon as we pop our Stibnite Flask, we're going to be moving faster, and whatever was in that ground degen radius to actually be impacted by the smoke cloud, they are going to have less chance to hit us, which is fantastic. It's layers upon layers of not getting hit. Don't get hit, don't die. Our last flask for this build to round out, and if we did have more flask slots, we would fill them because we're a Pathfinder. That's what we would do. But our fifth slot for this particular build is going to be a Chemist Diamond Flask of the Order. Its uptime is about 4.8 seconds, and it's going to give you an increased critical strike chance during the flask effectiveness, where your critical strike chance is lucky. For those of you wondering what lucky means in Path of Exile, it means that it rolls a number twice, essentially, with lucky rolls applying the best result and unlucky rolls applying the worst result. So, notice, when our critical strike chance is lucky while we are using a Diamond Flask, it's going to take any rolls that weren't a crit, and if there's two rolls that are being used, it's going to pick the one that was better rather than the one that was worse. So essentially, we're critting more often, more frequently, on a more consistent basis through the use of a Diamond Flask. And that is a fantastic DPS boost for consistent purposes, for consistency, which oftentimes Wander characters lack, or simply Glass Cannon characters lack, as they're going in to fight a boss. Because we're playing Pathfinder, all of our flasks have greater effectiveness and greater uptimes, as well as greater regeneration, which means we're going to have better boss DPS overall. We're going to be critting more often, more frequently, and more consistently as we are fighting bosses, because we are a Pathfinder and because our critical strike chance will be lucky. Well, thanks so much for watching today's featured build discussion, our 13th episode in the series, and thanks so much to Tomahawk U for letting us use his particular build guide as our format for the discussion this week. Of course, I want to give him a big shout out because this is one of the better written and presented guides that are on the forum. It's got beautiful, beautiful headers that are built in, so that way you'll never have a question about what it is that you're looking at. And lastly, one of his great headers that he's got an FAQ for many different questions that he's received over multiple different leagues. He's played this build for, I believe, the last 4 leagues. He's kept it updated. So if you're looking for a build guide creator who is going to maintain their build guide and who actually takes the time to respond to your questions and to your feedback, then I can recommend no build higher. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope today is the day a Mirror of Calandra drops for you. Thanks for watching that video. If you'd like more information on any of our discussion points today, you can see them down below in the video description. If you'd also like to join our Discord or support our Patreon, you can do so with the links down below. Thanks again, and big shout out to all of our Patreon supporters.